The next concept is bias and blinding. What is meant by bias, guys?
I think bias is a systematic error in your results.
Yes, that's correct. So it's a systematic error committed when you started conducting the study and all the way without your knowledge when you concluded study, that without your knowledge there was error and the results are deviating from the truth because of the systematic error committed from beginning of the trial to end of the trial. So next question comes from me is, what is the difference between a bias and a risk of bias? Artemis?
Risk of bias is the probability of having bias, whereas bias itself is the established bias.
That's correct. So bias is proven already, beyond doubt there is a bias in that study. But the risk of bias is under investigation or scrutiny. So my next question comes to Varun. So is there any difference between imprecision and bias?
Yeah, so imprecision is a random error, whereas bias is a systematic error.
So what is random error, Varun?
So I think that random errors occur at various points randomly, and the amount of errors can vary each time.
Okay, so the random error is not regular. A systematic error happens every time you measure. Is that correct?
Yeah.
That's correct. So Matthew, so if there is a risk of bias, is there anything that gets affected like quality? And how do you interpret risk of bias and quality?
So the risk of bias and the quality of the results are linked. If the risk of bias is high, the chance that the results differ from the true results is quite high, and therefore the quality of the paper, of the results may be low.
That's correct. So you generate a poor quality outcomes and poor quality paper. So Artemis, would you be able to kindly show a demonstration for the viewers how we classify all the included studies into various domains of the bias as per Cochrane? So please kindly show the viewers Cochrane tool of assessment of bias for included studies.
Hi, my name is Artemis and I'm going to show you how to use the Cochrane risk of bias tool for my study. So there's 5 domains of bias. There's selection bias, there's performance bias, there's attrition bias, detection bias, and finally reporting bias. So to begin with, selection bias has 2 categories. It has the random sequence generation and the allocation concealment. So if these 2 have been performed in the study, then you can click low risk of bias. Other kind of choices we have are unclear risk of bias and high risk of bias. So moving forward to the performance of bias, it refers to the blinding of participants and personnel. So if that has been done, then there is low risk of bias. Attrition bias refers to the incomplete outcome data, so missing data or losses to follow up. Detection bias refers to the blinding of outcome assessors. So if there was blinding, then detection bias is low risk. And finally, reporting bias refers to the incomplete or selective reporting of outcomes and results. So if there is no selective reporting, then the bias is low risk. Thank you.
Anybody in the group, what are the other sources of bias?
Yeah, so I can also think of publication bias as well as statistical bias.
What is meant by publication bias?
So publication bias is bias that doesn't originate from the study itself, but from the way or where it was published. So, for example, you may be more likely to publish in one journal, or you may have only selected particular articles based on where they were published.
What is meant by statistical bias?
Statistical bias is bias that originates in your actual statistical analysis within your study. So you might have done the wrong test, which has the wrong assumptions, or you may have done too many statistical analyses and then therefore had false positive results.
So my student Charlie is going to do a demonstration how to summarize various studies into low risk, intermediate risk and high risk.
Brilliant, thank you Mr. Uppara. As Mr. Uppara has just said there, we need to classify each study as either high risk, moderate risk, also known as unclear, or low risk. This is so that we can classify each overall study and know within our meta-analysis or within our systematic review how many studies were high, low and moderate risk. As my colleague Artemis has shown you, we can classify each study with each of the 5 Cochrane domains, but this doesn't tell you the overall risk of bias for each study. The way we do this is if in those 5 Cochrane domains, if 3 of them have been classified as high risk, we'll classify that overall study as a high risk study. And therefore you know that that's a high risk study, and therefore the risk of bias in that study will likely affect the results that you're given from that study. If, however, only 2 of the domains are classified as high risk, then that overall study will be classified as a moderate risk of bias study. And if less than 2 domains are classified as high risk and the majority are therefore low or unclear risk of bias, that will be a low risk bias study, and therefore when analysing the results of that study, you can be sure that those results aren't affected by bias and are more likely to represent the true values.
As we have seen, my student Charlie has demonstrated nicely how he summarized into low risk, intermediate risk and high risk studies. But there is another layer to it. We can actually quantify the bias. So while assessing risk of bias in included studies, we can do meta-regression and subgroup analysis and then can quantify the risk of bias.
So Mr. Uppara, what is this meta-regression and how does it actually account for the risk of bias?
So that's a very good question, Matthew. So when you do meta-regression, you get I-square values, you get tau-square value, you get R-square value. So although we ignore heterogeneity when you do meta-regression, but obviously there is a heterogeneity that is displayed as I-square and tau-square. So there is inherent heterogeneity and inherent variance. So when there is inherent heterogeneity and variance, obviously there should be risk of bias. Is that correct, Matthew?
I assume so, yes, sir.
Okay. So moving to next step. So how do we quantify the risk of bias? I was saying the quantifying risk of bias is possible by doing a meta-regression or subgroup analysis. Does anyone in the group know how to quantify the risk of bias?
Is that the thing that's called the ratio of odds ratios?
That's correct, Charlie. So ratio of odds ratio is nothing but if we do a ratio of interventions of odds ratio in studies at high or unclear risk of bias with that of intervention of odds ratio in studies with a low risk of bias, you get a ratio between high risk and low risk studies or unclear risk studies and low risk studies. So that is the quantity of the risk you encounter when you pool high risk studies together. If the ratio of odds ratio is more than 1, that means that the high risk studies are reporting higher coefficients and higher odds ratio. That means spurious results compared to low risk studies. So now my student Artemis is going to come and demonstrate how we can quantify the risk of bias using meta-regression equations.
Now I'm going to show you how to quantify the risk of bias. So these are the 4 studies of low risk of bias that we're going to include in our study. These are the 3 studies of high risk of bias that we're going to include in our study. So going back to the low risk of bias studies, if we pull the data and we perform the meta-regression equation, this is the coefficient that we find. Same-wise, if we perform the meta-regression equation for the high risk of bias studies, this is the coefficient that we get. Now, in order to quantify the risk of bias, we have to divide the coefficient of the high risk of studies over the coefficient of the low risk of studies. And if that number comes to be more than 1, that means that the coefficient of the high risk of studies is greater than the coefficient of the low risk of studies. Therefore, our results would be wrong if we include the high risk of bias. For example, if the coefficient of the high risk of studies comes to be 8 and the coefficient of the low risk of studies comes to be 2, 8 over 2 comes out to be 4, and that means that the risk of bias in our study is 4 times bigger if we include the high risk of studies.
So to conclude, validity, bias, blinding coexist. So we need to identify all the 3 and various possibilities of risk of bias that can be either because of blinding or because of lack of validity. Thank you.